Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 72nd in our series on Middle Eastern and Islamic history. This is modern Syria with the Assads, right? Last time we covered Syria really trying to find its footing, and we're going to see some of that tonight because some of that spilled over, but we're going to increasingly see what Syria looks like when you have a dynastic hold on power. But before we can get to all of the fun stuff, permit me to explain the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics we will be discussing tonight. That said, I will try to make this a secular presentation, meaning that I'm not biased in favor of either side, trying to relay the facts as objectively as I can. And like all topics in Middle Eastern history, this one is, of course, sensitive, especially as we get closer and closer to the modern day. And so, of course, we should invoke Will Wheaton's law of being respectful. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat. And of course, afterwards, after 2 hours, we will have a question and answer session where you are more than free to raise your hand, and I will take those comments as they come. I like to say that these presentations, these classes are a 101 and a 201, a 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up, and a 201 meaning that if you already know stuff on the subject, I'll probably tell you stuff you didn't know still. This presentation is a 2-hour hard stop, so anything we don't cover will roll over into next week. And of course, I think that's sort of a meta joke of how Syria treats Lebanon anyway. So you'll sort of see the humor in that, or the sad humor in that, as we get into next week's discussion and perhaps even tonight. When I put dates below a person, those are typically the years of service. If it's a political figure, it's the years of life. If it's a thought leader. And of course, this, like all the other 71 episodes in the Middle Eastern Islamic History series and all the other series that History Mostly Ancient discussions produce, can be found on our YouTube page. They're all recorded. Please subscribe to our YouTube page, and that way you can see any upcoming videos. That said, if you'd like to be part of this Zoom and ask those kinds of questions, we would love to have you. So please join our meetup, and you can be advised as to when those presentations are going to be and how you can be a part of them. And finally, we have premium Zoom, premium YouTube, and premium Meetup, which means that we are paying a lot of money to keep the lights on. Now, to be fair, we're going to continue to do this for free and give out these amazing, at least in my humble opinion, quasi-professional discussions free of charge. But if you think that this is incredible, if you've enjoyed your experience, I encourage you to help us cover our fundamental expenses. All right. So we talked about last week, when it came to pre-modern Syria, that that Syria, from the period of 1946 when it got independence to then the year 1970, which we haven't quite gotten to yet, is a period of chronic instability where we have a number of defining features. And it's important to remember what those are as we go further into Syrian history. The first one is that there's constantly shifting alliances around Syria. For example, whether Iraq is controlled by the Hashemites and is therefore a Western-aligned monarchy, or whether it's controlled by Arab nationalists or Arab socialists, or it's controlled by somebody else. And so because of these constantly changing alliances, Syria as a weaker state in the region overall, but a strong state in the Levant, has to sort of balance all these different issues. You have a huge sense of paranoia, which only becomes augmented when we develop the security state of Abdulhamid al-Sarraj. We have a nearly constant barrage of coups. We talked about a few of them, but within the period from 1946 to 1970, there are about 20 different coups, and you should understand that there's this constant challenge of power. Some of these coups are successful, some of them aren't. But regardless, it is a very unstable time in Syrian history. We also are dealing with a Cold War scenario on the larger scale, and Syria has to sort of choose whether it wants to be Western aligned or Soviet aligned and what that means. And we're going to see that play out also during the Assad period. finally, we have this distinction between Aleppo and Damascus and those two different power centers, where Damascus is focused much more on sedentary economy, agriculture, a little bit of industry, and with an orientation towards the southwest, that's towards the rest of the Levant region. And Aleppo tends to be more of a trading elite, where their trade centers have historically been with what is today Turkey. And so Aleppo has sort of a northward and also eastward axis because of that trade coming through Iraq historically and from Iran through Syria and to the west. And so those perspectives are going to be juxtaposed against each other. One final thing I should add, and this is just as true in the Assad period as it is in the pre-Assad period, the sources for what these leaders are thinking, what they're doing, are incredibly rare and circumspect. Everybody is reporting on secret dealings and secret meetings. So what we know with a very high degree of uncertainty because of the lack of because of the just general opacity when it comes to Syrian governmental affairs. And we talked about how Syria first became independent, and that after independence, Syria's primary fear was being taken over by the Hashemites. And so you had this dichotomy between a weak military that they needed in order to keep power in the hands of the civilians, and a strong military that they would need to keep the Jordanians out. We also talked about various situations in the 1949 and 1950s that resulted in the rise of military strongmen like Hosni Azaim, who was able to end the war with Israel with a ceasefire, Adi Bashi Shakli, who resisted the possibility of a union with Iraq, the attempted invasion of Lebanon in 1958 to support Nasserists in the country during the period of the United Arab Republic. You have all these different realities. And we've talked about that during this period. A strong motivating factor was the pan-Arab political movement, that idea that Arabs are all one people, regardless of their country of origin. And those countries are artificial constructions created by either imperialists or colonialists or internecine conflict, but they're not a true border, and the Arab people should be in control of this entire region without borders and without differentiators. And so part of this pan-Arab movement gets incorporated into the Arab socialist movement, which naturally has a strong opposition to imperialism and colonialism, and increasingly what it sees as the clear manifestation of that in the Middle East, which they see as Israel. Now, one of the key aspects that we talked about, and we'll see how that sort of feeds into the Assad system, is Abdulhamid al-Sarraj and the military intelligence function that he expanded and developed throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. He would eventually be removed from Syria by Nasser himself, but not because he disapproved of the job Abdulhamid al-Sarraj was doing, or out of some human rights concern for the people who were tortured in the prisons of Syria, like Al-Meza prison, which is probably the most famous prison in Damascus, but because Abdulhamid al-Sarraj had too much power concentrated in his person, and Nasser saw that as a threat to his ability to control the region. But the Deuxième Bureau, or the intelligence apparatus that Abdulhamid al-Sarraj had created, was effectively functioning long after he was no longer in direct control of it. We then saw that Syria increasingly pulled away from the West, and it pulled away from the West for several key reasons. But most importantly, it became clear to a lot of Syrian officials that the United States was not interested in the welfare of Syria and the development of Syria. They weren't willing to give loans to Syria. unless they were conditioned on changing its attitude towards Israel. And they weren't in favor of Arab socialism, calling it communism and trying to disparage the independent Syrian reputation. So we then talked about the United Arab Republic and how that worked to fuse Egypt and Syria into one country for 3 years. But the UAR was broken up because of dissatisfaction, not by the general Syrian population, although they were certainly dissatisfied with Abdelhamid al-Sarraj's increasing power and use of the deuxième bureau for purposes of intimidation, but primarily because of, one, the military was humiliated by the Egyptian military. The Syrian military was generally dressed down, given lesser commands, and ordered around in their own country, which they found deeply disturbing. And both the Damascene and the Alpine business cliques were increasingly subject to economic restrictions as Nasser pulled away from a capitalist economy with certain redistribution characteristics, like Arab socialism generally portends, to an actual command economy, which would take away a significant portion of their wealth. So these elites, combined with the military, which was dissatisfied, was able to take Syria back from the UAR and rededicate it as an independent country. But because of how undesirable these groups were, these groups that had taken power, and that there was no clear vision of what to do once the UAR was removed, you had a period that was incredibly difficult for Nadhim al-Qudsi, who was representing the Aleppine elites from the Hizb al-Sha'ab, the People's Party. And Nadhim al-Qudsi tried to keep the government together. During his 15-month reign, he had numerous difficulties in doing that. He had several coups, and one of them was finally successful. That's the Ba'athist coup that we're going to start with today. So what are the Ba'athists and where are they coming from? So let's talk a little bit about that. So you have Michel Aflaq. Michel Aflaq was a Levantine Christian. He was Greek Orthodox. And so his view of what it meant to be an Arab is certainly colored by the fact that he's not a Muslim, right? He separates to a certain degree Arab identity from Muslim identity, which is something that a lot of Muslim Arab nationalists have had a lot of trouble doing. Despite that, there's certainly an aspect of Muslim identity and Islamic civilization in the view of an Arab and its cultural history. But Aflaq spent a significant portion of his time discussing the social aspect of Arab socialism. At a fundamental level, his issue was not that he wanted to create a command economy. He didn't want to remove landowners or business owners from their properties or from their position as the main power in society. But what he wanted to do was a certain degree of redistribution of that, and a redistribution of that because of the vast inequality that existed in Syria. When 1963 occurred and the Baathists came to power, roughly 80% of Syria owned less than the top 10%. And that top 10%, if we subdivide it further, there were about 1,000 families that controlled about 50% by themselves of Syria's wealth, large agricultural tracts of land. And this goes back to our discussion last week about how a significant portion of Syrians, especially prior to the beginning of the 20th century, were sharecroppers. And so the economy was in such a state that you didn't have a middle class. And from Michel Aflaq's point of view, the creation of this middle class was of paramount importance. So if we look at his second quote, right, what liberty could be wider and greater than binding oneself to the renaissance of one's nation and its revolution? The liberty we seek is not opposed to legislative measures to curb the exploitations of the feudalists, capitalists, and opportunists. By this, he means that he's going to go after those large landholders. And he's going to go after those incredibly wealthy individuals to try and redistribute a certain degree of that to the lower classes and therefore elevate them. It is a new and strict liberty which stands against pressure and confusion. Dictatorship is a precarious, unsuitable, and self-contradictory system which does not allow the consciousness of the people to grow. This last statement is actually relatively interesting, and it's one that we're going to draw a little bit of attention to. Ba'ath states are usually described as one-party states, be they in Syria or in Iraq. Neither of these countries is, in truth, a one-party state. It is a state where one party has dominance, but there are actually a coalition of different parties that are part of the parliamentary structure. And it was always a belief within Ba'athism that a pluralistic approach in terms of organizing the country was better than a singular approach of one party or one leader. And I think a certain part of this comes out of a direct reaction to Nasser and his attempt to not only centralize control of Syria in his person, but the idea that the various different constituencies couldn't have some kind of representation, couldn't discuss ideas openly. So during the period of 1961 to 1963, under Nawaf al-Qudsi, we see a large-scale evangelism by Ba'athists to the rural population of Syria, and they point out about the wealth and cronyism and wealth concentration that exists by and large in Syria, and so they're able to recruit, especially from disaffected populations. These are the Druze, the Ismailis, the Alawites. These are all populations that have historically within the Syrian system, as well as Syrian Sunni rural poor, been excluded from the major institutions of power because of the power that has been alternatively held by either the Aleppine business clique or the Damascene business clique. And the Ba'ath Party, when it comes into power, it comes into power led by Amin al-Hafiz, and you can actually see him in the picture on the lower left-hand side. He's the one to the furthest right in the picture. Amin al-Hafiz is effectively a strongman, and he leads this National Council of the Revolutionary Command after they take power. So they have this coup on the 8th of March in 1963, and all of these leaders come to power. And in Ba'athist form, they have different representatives of both the military and the civil society. Most of these leaders are military leaders, but they wanted that diversity of opinion, so they had civilian leaders as well. But as we know with Syria, there's an above the table system and a shadow system ever since Abdelhamid Sarraj developed this intelligence bureau, the Deuxième Bureau. And it actually got to a point about midway through 1964 that the civilian leaders became rather clear to them that the military leaders were having meetings without consulting them. And so the civilian leaders actually went to the military leaders and said, "Are you having secret meetings without us in attendance?" That should give you a sense of the degree of opacity, even within the governing institutions of Syria, with regards to how this was going to be managed. Another key difference with the Ba'athist revolution, as opposed to previous discussions within Syria that we've had, is that since this was a revolution primarily led by individuals from the impoverished classes, of course, the individuals who actually led the revolution were middle-class individuals or lower middle-class individuals, as opposed to the poor. But because of this, they were disproportionately few in number and certainly not well represented in Damascus, where they were governing from. And so this is the first time in Syrian history where you have what is effectively a minority government, a government that doesn't represent the will of the Syrian people in some way, shape, or form, and doesn't pull on a traditional power base, right? And so we have massive opposition to them from Damascus and from Aleppo. because of their attempts to concentrate power and their socialist ideals of ripping apart that crony capitalism. And so because of this, the revolution gets bloody. And it's the first of all of the purges in Syria that we've seen so far, where a significant portion of people are arrested, significant portion of people are killed, people are detained. It is an actual full-blown revolution as opposed to a removal of certain people in power, perhaps jailing them, exiling them, killing them, but it's, 10 people or fewer. Now we're talking about large-scale purges and even governmental purges where individuals are going to be increasingly kicked out of authority. Between 1963 and 1966, Amin al-Hafiz was able to collect most of the power to himself. But Nasser again wanted to promote the idea of unity. Since Syrian Baathists were in power, and the Baathists had always been the most in favor of a pan-Arab solution, right, a unification of the various Arab countries of any of the Syrian parties. And in earlier 1963, in February of 1963, there had been a revolt in Iraq that installed a Baathist leader. Abdel Nasser thought it was the appropriate time to try and hold more unity talks, to try and bring Nasserists and Baathists together under one government. It's unclear exactly why Syria didn't either commit to the talks more fully, but we know that on the 28th of April, 1963, they had signaled their willingness to sign a declaration that would create some more federalized system that would control both Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, not the full devolution that occurred in the UAR. And then they changed their mind and they persecuted anybody who was sympathetic to Nasser within Syria and made it clear that they would not unite with Syria. This led to a failed coup against Amin al-Hafiz by Jassim al-Wan. Jassim al-Wan was a Nasserist who had been part of the Baath coup in 1963, and he felt that Amin al-Hafiz was going against that Arab part of Arab socialism, that pan-Arab unity. And so he led a number of Nasserists in an abortive coup against Amin al-Hafiz. He was discovered, he was jailed and tried, and many of the Nasserists were purged from the government. With this action, Nasser gets on the radio, which, as we've discussed with Egypt, Nasser's great tool of Arab unification was not convincing the leaders of the various countries that they should unify, but his tool was in convincing the population that they should embrace pan-Arabist beliefs, that they should connect, and that they should be successful. And so over the radio, he declared that the Syrian government under Amin al-Hafiz was made of murderers and fascists, people who were against the Arabs, against the unity of all Arab peoples, and that got people to riot. And in fact, we see, for example, in 1964, in the city of Hama, a particularly large riot by Syrians who felt that Amin al-Hafiz had betrayed the primary Arab cause of the Arab socialist movement. Amin al-Hafiz responded militarily and subdued the protests. It's estimated that between 70 and 100 people died in these protests. And then from this point on, from 64 onwards, we start to have fights within the Baath, cliques purging other cliques, and it starts to winnow down the number of individuals. At first, the National Council, the National Committee, the NCRC has 14 members, but it starts to dwindle down bit by bit until we get to 1966. And in 1966, we have a coup that is successful. It's led by two military officers, Saleh Jadid and Hafiz al-Assad. And these two leaders argue that the policies pursued by the Ba'ath that have come to power are actually not in the interest of the true Arab socialism as they would understand it. And this coup, because it was militarily aligned, was successful. And in fact, one of the ironies of this history is that Michel Aflaq, who you can see there in this picture, and Salahuddin al-Bitar, who are two of the three historical founders of the Ba'athist movement, the other being Zaki al-Arsuzi, were forced into exile from the regime that they had helped install. And both of them wrote increasingly about the government of Saleh Jadid and Hafiz al-Assad, that to them it didn't look like the Baathism that they imagined. Both Jadid and al-Assad were fundamentally against the principle of pan-Arab unity. Syria was Syria, and it would maintain its borders intact. And in fact, from this point onwards, Syria does not entertain any idea of a pan-Arab solution. It does have an idea of a Levantine solution, perhaps the integration of Lebanon or something else, but its eyes towards Egypt are forever closed, and its eyes towards Iraq are forever closed. And Saleh Jadid was the person who took direct political power. So he negotiated with al-Assad, and what would be probably his biggest mistake. He gave Assad control of the military, and he took control of civilian affairs. And from 1966 until he would be overthrown in turn in 1970, he engaged in what most people would properly term either planned economy or communism. And he did that through a variety of different means. The first one is that he engaged in large-scale land expropriation. He began to redistribute the lands of large landholders, both in Damascus and Aleppo, and give them to the poor. He also began a process of industrialization in Syria, a process that Hafiz al-Assad would continue. In either case, the process of industrialization in Syria never made industry a dominant part of the Syrian economy, but it made it larger than it had been. Jadid also began a number of infrastructure and development projects. Probably the most famous of them were along the Euphrates River, which runs for a small part in eastern Syria. And he built the Tabqa Dam. It was completed under al-Assad's rulership later, but he organized and planned its construction, as well as laying the first few bricks as early as 1968. And this dam provides a significant portion of Syria's power generation, electricity generation. And one of the most striking things, especially in a part of the world that is very religious, was that he secularized and made public education. So you began to see a shift away from both clerics being able to teach and wanting to teach to a uniform Syrian curriculum. And Saleh Jadid, his view was that Syria should be this kind of modern, organized state along Soviet-style principles. One part that I didn't mention when it came to Saleh Jadid and Hafiz al-Assad and how they could maintain power despite being so few in their clique, there were only a few others that joined them, like Mohammed Umran, was that most of the clique, there were a few exceptions, but most of the clique were Alawites. And so it sort of goes back to what are Alawites and how did they get so much power? So Alawites in the grand history of Syria have generally been sharecroppers to Sunni Muslims. So they were among those impoverished classes, which is naturally why Ba'ath appealed to them. And they also have a history in the military, as we discussed, being part of the Troupes Spéciales du Levant, which was a French organized askari, right? That's indigenous soldiers who fight on behalf of local leaders, imperial appointed local leaders. And so because they have this military history, and a low economic status, they were easy to bring into the Ba'ath party, and they were well trained in order to enter the military. And in fact, during the Saleh Jadid period, you have an Alawitization of the military. That is to say that most of the Sunni commanders in high positions, which Sunnis represented over 70%, I think it was, of the high-level positions in the Syrian army in 1966. By 1970, that number had dropped to fewer than 10%. And because of that, those families, those Alawite families that were represented in the military, began to have a strong sectarian bond. One of the things that we discussed sort of earlier, especially in episode 54, was that during the time of the French Mandate, sectarianism was very minimal. It existed, certainly, but it was very minimal in terms of the Syrian fabric and political identity. But because of the need by this clique to rely on something, they relied on these sort of ethnic and sectarian differences. And knowing that those people who were part of that sect would naturally be in danger if the regime were to fall. And so that created an implicit loyalty and duty. Now, one of the things that I'm often asked when it comes to Alawites is their belief structure. And if you're interested in that, we can definitely talk about that at the end of this presentation in the Q&A. So I'll leave that for then. And during the Salah Jadid period, in the middle of all this turmoil, is the Six-Day War. And so it's not surprising that Syria does so poorly in the Six-Day War when you realize that their government was so chronically unstable that it had a coup literally the year before. And this is exactly when the Alawitization of the military is taking place. So you're removing experienced and veteran commanders for less experienced, more novice commanders. Something's got to give. And so if we sort of pin down the Syrian front in the Six-Day War, we have a few things that we should notice, right? The first thing is that the Syrian front in the Six-Day War started the last. The first, if you oversimplify things a little bit, the first 2 days of the war were Israel's destruction of Egypt. The second 2 days of the war were Israel's destruction of Jordan. And the third 2 days of the Six-Day War were its destruction of Syria. There is one exception to this, which is that after the Israeli forces had bombed the Egyptian tarmac, remember that Israel started the Six-Day War based on claim that it was a preemptive war, that the Egyptians were going to start and the Israelis were simply choosing the time to start on their own. Now, after the Israeli Air Force had bombed the tarmac and knocked out 2/3 of the Egyptian Air Force, the Egyptians sent out messages that they were actually winning. And the reason the Egyptians did this was primarily to garner further support, especially from Jordan, which had been hesitant about attacking Israel, and Syria, which had also been hesitant about attacking Israel. But hearing all those great messages about how Assad's Air Force was bringing the Israelis down, they decided to launch a squadron of fighters over northern Israel. The Israeli Air Force had returned to Israel proper by that point and chased those fighters out of Israeli territory, downing a few of them, and then proceeded to bomb the rest of the Syrian Air Force on the tarmac. Over 35 planes were taken out, which was also 2/3 of the Syrian Air Force. And that meant that all of their positions on the border with Israel were unable to be defended from the air. There was a huge debate within the Israeli leadership as to whether they should attack Syria or not, especially considering that Syria hadn't, other than this airstrike, hadn't really done anything differently than had been going on the border region with Syria since independence, which is to say that they were exchanging shells and other munitions in a sort of war of attrition, but nothing really rising to the point where Israel would actively declare war. But a number of generals prevailed in their argumentation, and they decided to march on Syria. Now, they had a lot of complex intelligence as to how the Syrian defenses were set up, primarily because of the espionage of Eli Cohen. Eli Cohen was a very famous Israeli spy. He managed to get into Syria in 1962 during the reign of Nadam al-Qudsi, and he had befriended Amin al-Hafiz. That was the key aspect to his ability to gather intelligence. And so during the 3 years that he spied under Amin al-Hafiz from 63 until 65, he was able to get out key information to Israel. One of the legends, we don't know how accurate this is that he was the one who convinced the Syrians to plant eucalyptus trees over Syrian entrenched bunker positions, which gave the Israelis the ability to attack those positions from the air and therefore neutralize them while their tanks were coming up the escarpment. Regardless, those last 2 days of the 6-day war, the 9th and the 10th, were incredibly difficult for Israelis who were making their way up that incredible height of the Golan region, and the Israelis then were able to push forward. It's worth noting that by the time the Israelis were actually coming up the side of the mountain, the UN had already passed Resolution 242, which was the ceasefire resolution. And they were trying to push Israel and Syria to recognize it. It's unclear whether Israel knew or suspected that Syria had recognized it, but was in the middle of its advance and wanted to complete it, or whether Israel didn't know and was waiting to hear from the Syrians that they had accepted the proposal. Either way, while the ceasefire was taking place, the Israelis were able to successfully invade the territory. Oh, something got corrupted. That's unfortunate, but so we then get to Black September. And Black September was a revolt within Jordan of the Palestinians who were living there. Now, after 1967, what had developed in Jordan was that there were a number of Jordanian Palestinians, because about 65% of Jordan's population at this point was ethnic Palestinian, who were enraged by Jordan's loss, and they were enraged by the pro-Western conciliatory attitude that King Hussein had, not to mention an attitude that was conciliatory towards Israel. Despite the fact that those two parties had literally just been at war, Hussein and the Israelis had a degree of back-channel communications. And King Hussein was worried about what he would do with these militants, especially the PFLP, the People for the Liberation of Palestine. And in fact, those groups were beginning to create states within states around Amman and other largely Palestinian areas. So on the 17th of February, 1970, the Jordanians sent a communique through the Americans to the Israelis, asking 3 major questions. Does Israel agree to avoid taking advantage of the opportunity of Hussein having to use his own forces to deal with subversive elements border with Israel? Can Israel avoid responding to Palestinian provocations? And can Hussein count on Israel to assist him if the forces of neighboring countries come to the aid of the Palestinian terrorists? What neighboring countries was he thinking of? He was, of course, thinking of Syria. And the Israelis agreed with these terms. They were hesitant on the third one, but it turned out that the Jordanians didn't need Israeli help anyway. When the Syrian military crossed into Jordan on the 18th of September, 1970, they were beaten back by a barrage of Jordanian cannon fire on their northern border and went back to Syria in disgrace. The attack was, of course, led by the Secretary of Defense of Syria, who was Hafez al-Assad, as Salah Jadid had given him power over the military. And because of that failure, when Hafiz al-Assad returned home to Syria, Saleh Jadid had managed to bring together the rest of the clique together, the ruling clique, and they were arguing that Hafiz al-Assad and those few in the party who were still loyal to him, like Mustafa Tlass, were enemies of the regime and should be thrown in prison or exiled, anything else. And then, of course, Hafiz al-Assad surrounded the room with his soldiers, and suddenly, for all their declarations and bluster, Saleh Jadid had no actual power. He was arrested, and he was detained in Al-Mazeb prison, where he died in 1993. So for the next 23 years, he languished in prison, and most of the Baathists that had sided with him were rejected from the government. Assad took this moment to perform the corrective revolution, as he called it, or the corrective movement. And Haraka al-Sahihiyya in Arabic. And in this corrective movement, he made a number of substantive changes to the platform of the Ba'ath. The first was that he basically ripped the entire socialist piece right out of the system, and he made a strong alliance with Damascene notables. He was going to run a Damascus-based government like Shukri al-Quwatli had done. And part of that was accepting the presence in the Syrian parliament of a significant number of Sunni Muslims. In fact, one of the most common arguments to say that Syria isn't an Alawite dominant government is that the majority of parliamentarians in the parliament are Sunnis that Hafiz al-Assad either promoted or connected with in order to put them there. But of course, this ignores the duality of Syria with having a facial government and a shadow government. And the shadow government was, of course, the military that Hafiz al-Assad controlled, and which by his time was 90% Alawite-led, which meant that effectively the real power in Syria, which is the military and the mukhabarat, or the intelligence apparatus that was connected to it, was in the hands of this Alawite minority, and specifically those Alawites that Hafiz al-Assad felt he could trust. Another key piece of change that Hafiz al-Assad began to implement, especially as we get closer to 1973, is that the atheism of, or secularism, perhaps we should say, of Syria under Saleh Jadid begins to go away. We start to see Islam returning in a certain way to the Syrian constitution. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. We also see the first time that Syria has had a presidential election that is a referendum. That is to say that the vote is not between multiple candidates. The vote is, do you accept Hafiz al-Assad to be the president of Syria? And Assad won with 99.2%. And my heart, breaks for the 0.8% who voted against. I hope that nothing serious happened to them. The Syrian constitution set out a number of governmental reforms. Among these reforms on paper were the freedom of speech, the freedom to vote for elected office, all of these kinds of things. But in reality, those positions that were being voted for, that freedom of speech, was all circumscribed by the intelligence apparatus. One of the elements that shows how freedom of speech was really almost a joke in Syria is the story of Ghurbet. So Ghurbet was a famous play that was published in Syria. It was filmed and broadcast on Syrian television during Ramadan, because during Ramadan is when you see a lot of sort of television serials show up. People are at home, they're not working as hard. It's sort of a natural fit. And Ghurba is a satire on the nature of government and the sort of difficulty in approving the constitution, that is to say, that it was handed to the people again in a referendum. And in particular, I would encourage those of you who speak Arabic to watch it. It's quite hilarious. This particular moment is from a scene where the man on the right is talking to the man on the left, who is supposedly an official in the town. And he's complaining that the man is incompetent. Who has empowered this man? Oh, well, he's empowered by the Constitution. What Constitution? I haven't seen a Constitution. It's on the saddlebag. Where's the saddlebag? With the donkey. Where's the donkey? In the jail. Why is the donkey in the jail? Because it ate the Constitution out of the saddlebag. And so you can see sort of the circuitous nature of not having real answers, that everything is concretized, but concretized by an outside agent, and an agent that you can't control, and whose orders you simply have to take, regardless of the quality of the person issuing them. But the most striking piece of Ghurba is that it was produced by the government of Syria. In fact, the majority of the opposition or the satire, especially in the 70s, commenting on Hafez al-Assad, was in fact Assad's own creation, in order to try and show, at least to the Syrian population, that they had a certain degree of freedom of thought, even though all of that dissent was manufactured. So the next major point is that Hafez al-Assad begins this process that is called that I've called Caudiozation. Somebody commented that Hafez al-Assad sounds very Machiavellian. That is absolutely the case. Most people have accorded him that sort of mental status. And the reason I call the reforms of Hafez al-Assad Caudiozation is because his legitimation for power is no longer the ascription of defending the idealism of Arab socialism. He doesn't try to do that anymore. He defends his right to rule by the fact that he is ruling. That is it. And of course, he will resist any other form of government. The most common one that's approaching, especially as we get into the 1970s, and people are increasingly jaded when it comes to Arab socialism because of how it doesn't work against Israel, and it doesn't improve people's economic situations, no matter how hard they try. Islamism, or the idea of creating an Islamic theocratic government, begins to become more popular. And so, of course, these leaders will work very hard against the Islamists. And of course, during the Caudiozation period, we're going to see changes in the Cold War that are going to make the Soviet Union a less and less attractive partner moving forward. And so we see a rapprochement with the West. And part of that rapprochement and part of the realignment away from Arab socialism is the re-entrenchment of those historic business cliques. Egypt was one example, and we sort of talked about how Anwar Sadat was responsible for re-empowering a lot of the business elites in Egypt, and the same is true for Hafez al-Assad. Now, we then get to the October War, also known as the Yom Kippur War or the Ramadan War, in 1973, and this is the next war against Israel. But unlike 67, which was Israel launching preemptively, this was the Arab states launching a war, hoping to reclaim some of the land that Israel had taken in 1967 without concluding a peace treaty. Now, the Soviets were assisting the Egyptians to a certain degree, especially in the 1970 War of Attrition, and there were some technical advisors there. There were also Soviet technical advisors in Syria, trying to organize the Syrian developments. Hafez al-Assad went to the battle positions And the Syrians made some small gains. They didn't make anything close to the kinds of gains the Egyptians made, but they made these small gains into the Golan Heights before the Israelis pushed them backwards. And they made those gains because of the technology that they had gotten from the Soviets, and because now the commanders had been stabilized for a long enough period that they were able to advance and retreat. One of the particular outcomes that is worth talking about when we talk about the 73 war, the October War, is that it fundamentally changed the relationship between Israel and Syria that have been going on pretty much since the beginning of the state, and changed even further from the way that had occurred between 1967, when Israel first took the Golan, and 1973. The first fundamental change is that because Israel took the Golan in 67, the Syrians were not able to effectively shell Israeli positions, which they had been able to do when the border was on the Jordan River, or very close to it. And the second part was that for the first time, Israel and Syria were now separated. What ended up happening was the declaration of what was called the UNDOF, the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force. And the UN resolutions had put this force in power. This was a group of UN soldiers that were from countries that recognized both Israel and Syria and maintained relations with both countries. And these people create a buffer zone between Israel and Syria, such that the two countries can't actually send their militaries to fight with each other and can't launch rockets or other missiles at each other. Because of this, Syria, the Syrian-Israeli border, with the exception of during the Syrian civil war, because the Syrian government didn't always control the Syrian side of the UNDOF, became largely peaceful, in the sense that there was no conflict. But there are certainly scars of war that exist on what is there called the Purple Line. The first one is the city of Al-Quneitra. Al-Quneitra was a relatively large city. It was the capital of the province when it was under complete Syrian control. And as you can see from the map of the Purple Zone, it is literally on the edge of the UNDOF and the area that Israel controls. The city was blasted quite severely by the Israelis when the Israelis were applying a counteroffensive to the Syrians and marching towards Damascus. After the war, the Israelis invited the Syrians to rebuild it. The Syrians refused, and they refused primarily to show the world, in their view, the devastation that Israel had created, and they didn't want to undo that. And so the city of Al-Quneitra is, to this day, a ruin like you see in this picture. Another scar is less visible, and that is the division of the clans. Let me explain. So within the territory of what is the Golan Heights, there were both Sunni and Druze populations. The Sunni populations, by and large, fled into mainland Syria during the Israeli occupation in 1967. And because of that, the only Syrian resident population under Israeli control are Druze, with a few small exceptions. But because of this, there are Druze clans on both sides of the Purple Line. And many families want to wed their children between groups on either side. Syria and Israel have come to an agreement through the UNDOF and their mediation that Druze brides can cross from the Israeli-controlled Golan into mainland Syria. If they do so, however, they can never return to the Golan, which means that they will, in most cases, never see their families ever again. That said, you can see in the picture there, those are Druze brides that are crossing into sovereign Syrian territory in order to marry the man that they've never actually met, but to whom they've been promised. And this has gone on since the mid-1980s. One of the strange ironies of the Israeli wars with the Palestinians and with the Arab states more generally is that Israel prefers to rule the West Bank as a military authority. They've never tried to move towards annexation in a clear and coherent way. And they've never tried to organize the territory in sort of a civilian function. There are two territories that are exceptions. The eastern part of Jerusalem was, under the Jerusalem Law of 1980, annexed to the State of Israel. And the Golan Heights in 1981 was annexed to the northern region of Israel. Of course, those annexations are violations of the UN resolutions on the matter. But it means that the people living in the Golan, those Druze, have the ability to take Israeli citizenship if they want it. For the most part, they have resisted, saying that they are Syrian citizens. And on a side note, they're probably very afraid of what would happen if Syria did take the Golan back and they had Israeli passports. But increasingly, with the situation in the Syrian civil war, some of the Druze in the Golan are accepting Israeli citizenship. Now things are going to get interesting. So there's going to be three parallel issues that sort of follow us from 1973 until about 1990 or so. And those three parallel issues are, we're going to see an Islamist insurgency within Syria. And then we're going to see a fundamental shift in Middle Eastern politics in 1979, when Egypt and Israel make peace, and when Iran and Israel unmake peace because of Iran's Islamic Revolution. And we're also going to see, of course, the Lebanese civil war, in which Syria is a clearly active part in that conflict. So let's get to the Islamists first. All right, so the first thing is that Hafez al-Assad is an Alawite. And this presented a particular problem because if we look at the constitution of Syria before 1973, in the third paragraph, it says quite clearly, Din Ra'is al-Jumhuriyya al-Islam, the religion of the president of the republic is Islam. And Alawism, for various reasons, again, I'll discuss it in the Q&A, is not viewed by many Sunni Muslims, especially in Syria, as being a form of Islam. And so Hafez al-Assad originally tried to remove this article from the constitution, and that was meant with a significant backlash, a backlash so significant, in fact, that he put it back in. One of the things that we have to remember is that Syria is a conservative country, and even the United States at this time would have rejected it if we didn't have a long history of secularism. Because in the Syrian view, to remove that requirement that the religion of the president of the republic is Islam is to say that the state is an atheist state. And of course, the conservative Muslim perception of atheism is that it is a monstrous set of principles based in material wealth generation, and that it is something that seeks to destroy without any clear sense of propriety. And so you have this perception that's sort of echoed by this biggest killers in history propaganda. And I say that because Hideki Tojo was definitely not an atheist, neither was Hitler. And to the extent that these other individuals were atheist, their atheism was not a motivating factor, all these things. Regardless, this was the dominant view in Syria. And so Hafez al-Assad needed to legitimize himself and to legitimize Alawite rule as being acceptable under this third article of the Constitution. And so there were two major decisions that were made. with regards to how he would demonstrate Islamic credentials. The first one was a meeting with Musa al-Sadr. Musa al-Sadr is a Shiite cleric based in Lebanon, but who was originally from Iran. And they met several times. This is a picture of them in 1975, but the relevant time frame for the meeting that we're talking about is in 1973. And he procured from Musa al-Sadr the declaration that Alawites were themselves a sect of Sunni Shia Twelver Islam, and therefore were true Muslims, as that term is understood. That did some of the hard work. The other part of the hard work was the Sunnification of Alawism. That is to say that Alawites began to behave in ways much more reminiscent of Sunni Muslims than traditional Alawite behaviors would be, such as praying in mosques, such as observing the Muslim holidays primarily, and other cultural activities that were more visibly Sunni, more similar to the Sunni dominant population of the region. And so because of this, more and more people began to accept Hafiz al-Assad as a Muslim. That said, those people who were religious or pious Muslims and wanted a theocracy knew that they were not going to get it with Hafiz al-Assad. And this is where you get the Muslim Brotherhood saying Islam is the solution. Islam huwa al-hal. And that became the campaign of the Muslim Brotherhood, especially as Assad's regime of intelligence gathering, torture, and repression continued in full swing. So what we see between 1976 and 1982 is an Islamist insurgency, right? Those Islamists are the people that want to create an Islamic theocracy in Syria. And they start with the Muslim Brotherhood, but then even the Brotherhood itself can't tolerate this violence. And so you start having divisions within it that break apart. One of them is called the Taliya al-Qatila, or the Fighting Vanguard. And the Fighting Vanguard begins in an asymmetric war against Assad's state. They're motivated in many ways by Syrian Islamist preachers that had left Syria because of issues with the government, like Said Hawa. And these individuals argued that you needed to implement a state according to Quranic principles, and where the Sharia was the only law of the land. That's how you would have justice and true equality in the country. In order to wage this asymmetric war, both the Fighting Vanguard and their spiritual leaders outside of the country argued that the best way was through targeted assassinations. And so the Vanguard killed quite a number of Syrian officials, and in response, the Syrian police arrested significant numbers of Islamists and brought them to prisons, especially the prison in Palmyra. The prison in Palmyra in particular was a horrible place in terms of how the prisoners were treated and the life that they could expect when in prison. But even with that, after a number of targeted assassinations had taken place, Assad ordered the execution of an untold number of militants that had been jailed there. To the extent that we have testimony about it, it is exclusively from people who have fled to Jordan because of Jordan's historical antipathy towards Syria, right? That historical relationship. They argue that between 400 and 550 inmates were killed. But the targeted assassinations kept coming. Probably the most famous one was the Aleppo military cadet massacre on the 16th of June, 1979, where Adnan Okla went to a training institute for young military cadets for the Assad regime and opened fire, killing a few dozen military cadets. At first, Hafiz al-Assad wanted to keep it hushed, but the story had a way of leaking out. And it caused immense consternation from all sides in the country. It's worth pointing out why the revolution began in 76, though, as opposed to 73 or earlier. And it has to do a lot with the fact that at this point, Syria had intervened in the Lebanese civil war and had chosen the side of the Maronites, the Christian population, over the side of the Sunni population. And so the fact that this leader who was pretending to be Muslim would fight against Muslims for Christians was something that they found untenable. We then move, of course, to a number of different city attacks. And in order to quash the rebellion once and for all, what Hafiz al-Assad decided to do was go to one of the cities with the strongest concentration of anti-regime sentiment, which was Hama. And he sent his airplanes there to bomb the entire old city and soldiers on the ground to massacre what was mostly a civilian population. Estimates widely vary for the amount of people who've been killed in Hama. For obvious reasons, there's not been an objective historical inquiry into this. So, depending on the reports, between 10,000 and 40,000 people were killed. It is the single worst action by an Arab despot against his population in the 20th century. There's a question, the massacre at Homs. That's the massacre I've got there. I think Homs, sorry, was hit before Hama, but regardless, both of these were extremely tragic. I'm sorry that all the pictures are messed up, but anyway, one of the major changes is that Iran was able to overthrow its previous government. That was the government of the Shah that was Western aligned. And suddenly the Islamists came to power in Iran. And the encouragement of the Islamists in Iran, of course, fed into the Islamist uprising in Syria. But one of the ironies is that, by and large, when it came to the 1979 shift, the Ayatollahs of Iran were actually more open to Assad than they were to the Islamists. And one of the primary reasons was that those Islamists were Sunni and Iran was Shiite. And so Shiite Islamism and Sunni Islamism, because of their religious imprimatur, were generally opposed to one another. Another thing is that Iran was searching for allies in its crusade against the Zionists. Ever since Egypt made peace with Israel, and then of course Syria broke relations with Egypt for making peace with Israel, he considered that act a huge act of betrayal. Iran saw the possibility of a fertile alliance with Syria, and so it actually accepted these horrible human rights actions against Islamists because they saw them as an unimportant casualty. And one of the interesting things is that in 1982, Ruhollah Khomeini and Hafiz al-Assad met, and Ruhollah Khomeini agreed with Musa al-Sadr that Syria was actually that the Alawites were actually a sect of Shiite Twelver Islam and therefore could manifest as Muslim rulers in their country. And of course, Syria fits into the wider constellation of Iran's new power projection into the region, which was directly contesting Saudi Arabia and its power projection. A lot of those proxy wars that started in 79 are the ones that have led to a divided Yemen, have led to conflicts within Iraq and Syria, other than the American invasion itself. And of course, some of the issues of politics in Lebanon and Syria today. So we then get to Lebanon, and it's important to remember that Lebanon had a very unstable system that worked to a certain degree, and it was one in which there was a power sharing between the various different ethnic groups. Unlike Syria, which generally was demographically mixed, and where demography had very little influence on politics, probably the bigger difference was wealth or poverty rather than sect. In Lebanon, sect was part of the agreement. And starting in 1943, there was what was called the National Pact. And that pact would be that the Maronites would not look to the West, the Arabs would not look to the rest of the Muslims would not look to the rest of the Arab world. Lebanon would stay in independent unity of its own. And there would be a ratio of 6-5 in favor of Christians against Muslims in the Lebanese parliament. And then certain roles would be taken by certain politicians. The president would always be a Maronite Christian. The prime minister would always be a Sunni Muslim. The speaker of the parliament would always be a Shiite Muslim, and so on and so forth. We're going to talk a lot more about how this system and how it works in tomorrow's presentation, next week's presentation. And another thing we have to keep in mind is that there was a significant Palestinian population in Lebanon. In raw numbers, there were more Palestinians in Lebanon than there were in Syria. But as a fraction of the total population, it's significantly more. It's at the time of the Lebanese Civil War, Palestinians were between 5 and 10% of the total population of Lebanon. To give sort of a sense of what that's like, African Americans in the United States are about 12% of the population. So about 2/3 of the percentage of blacks, right? So it's a very noticeable population, and because of the UNRWA system, a very segregated population. Palestinians in Lebanon were not able to get jobs for the most part. They were not able to buy property or rent property outside of the different refugee camps in which they had been situated. And so those who did make money generally did so through the gray economy, the black market, or they did menial labor that could be kept off books. So the situation in the early days of the violence was that you began to have Palestinian militias effectively moving around the country. And one of those Palestinian militias was the Palestinian Liberation Army. Now, we should be clear that the Palestinian Liberation Army is not the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Those are two different things. The Palestinian Liberation Army was a false flag operation by the Syrians, where they put Syrians and Palestinians together to enforce the will of Syria, but they used the Palestinian flag and the Palestinian coat of arms. And in fact, the Syrians were behind several invasions by the Palestinian Liberation Army into areas, especially in the eastern part of Lebanon, and they threatened the Christian population. In 1976, especially around the time of the siege of Tel al-Zatar, the Syrian Christian leaders, especially Michel Suleiman, began to ask for Syrian intervention in order to deal with the increasing problem of dealing with these Palestinians and their Sunni Lebanese aligned factions. And Hafez al-Assad gladly entered the country with the Syrian army. As soon as he had arrived in the country and he began to establish himself, what ended up happening was that he was asked to form an Arab deterrent force. So in Riyadh in 1976, he and a number of other leaders, including Yasser Arafat, you can see there, Anwar Sadat, with whom Hafiz al-Assad did not have relations at this point, from Egypt, and several other Arab leaders, decided that they would create an Arab deterrent force, that it wouldn't just be the Syrians keeping peace in Lebanon. But regardless of this creation, most Arab countries did not want to send forces. And it ended up that even at the time of declaration, only 20% of the forces would be non-Syrian, and most of those left in a few years anyway, which gave the Syrians more or less uncontested control over Lebanon as a deciding linchpin in the increasingly volatile Lebanese civil war. In 1978, relations between the Syrians and the Maronite Christians really broke down, as it became increasingly apparent to them that the Syrians were actually there to control Lebanon and perhaps bring it into the Syrian fold. Hafiz al-Assad had always claimed that Lebanon was improperly separated from Syria and that Lebanon is a part of Syria. And so the Christians, not wanting to be under Syrian control, began to fight the Syrians. The first major fight was in the 100 Days War, which was over the streets of Beirut in order to get the Syrians out of the city. And by and large, they were successful in that. Where things got a little bit more interesting was around the town of Zahle, which was a Christian majority town in the Bekaa Valley, which was the strongest area of Syrian encampments inside of Lebanon. Bashir Gemayel led the battle, which took place in 6 months over the period from November of 1980 until about June of 1981, throughout the mountains, with the two sides shelling each other repeatedly. It's been jokingly called the Battle of the Destroyed Tanks, because Bashir Gemayel was very famous for destroying numerous Syrian tanks and cutting down the Syrian presence in the region. The Syrians also tried to influence the Lebanese civil war from a political standpoint. They had their own Syrian-Palestinian party, that is, Palestinians who were refugees in Syria became part of their own spin-off of the Ba'ath Party called Assa'iqa, meaning the storm. And Assa'iqa was dropped into Lebanese politics to try and create some degree of Syrian influence. Ultimately, it was unsuccessful, and other means of Syrian influence have prevailed since then. The next piece is that Hafiz al-Assad wanted to create a coalition of Shiite militants that would more accurately reflect the will of the government of Syria. And the first militia group that it aligned with was the Amal movement. Now you can see they're holding a picture of Musa al-Sadr. Musa al-Sadr was their spiritual leader, and because of his relationship in 1973 with Hafiz al-Assad conferring upon him that Islamic legitimacy, it was a natural fit for the Syrian leader to begin investing money and training and weaponry to the Amal movement, which claimed to represent not only Shiites in Lebanon, who were historically disenfranchised, but also to represent the generally disenfranchised population. We should also point out that the Palestinian Liberation Army, that false flag Syrian military, was also operating in Lebanon. And of course, as Iran became more and more involved in the Syrian civil war, relationships were developed between the nascent Hezbollah, which was founded in 1982, and in 1982, with Syria as well. In fact, Hezbollah is primarily an Iranian proxy, but because of Iran and Syria's relationship as allies, it is functionally a Syrian proxy as well. One thing that's worth pointing out is that during the continuing Syrian military occupation of Lebanon, Syria maintains a military presence in Lebanon until the Cedar Revolution of 2005. the Syrians have a number of guest workers in Lebanon, and they naturalize those guest workers as Lebanese citizens, which meant that Syria was also playing with the fire of demographic change in Lebanon, the exact same issue that had started the Lebanese civil war in the first place. Of course, one of the biggest issues for Syria was when Israel got involved directly in the Lebanese civil war. In fact, that victory by Bashir Gemayel in Zahla would have been impossible without Israeli aid. And the Israelis actually ended up invading Lebanon directly, as we talked about in the Israel episode. And we'll talk again about about next week in more detail. But it's worth pointing out that Israelis are invading from the south and Syrians are invading from the west. And so you ended up having a number of clashes, at least abortive ones, between Israel and Syria. Thankfully, a lot of skilled diplomacy by the Americans prevented all-out war between Israel and Syria in the territory of Lebanon, which would have been a disaster for all three parties. And so we move into what is the Syrian occupation of Lebanon. So the Syrian soldiers that were there during the Lebanese Civil War just didn't leave. In 1989, the Ta'if Agreement was signed, and the Ta'if Agreement basically re-established the 1943 pact, but this time it was 5-5, that Muslims and Christians would be equally represented in Lebanese parliament. And the Syrians maintained a hold on Lebanese society, and they maintained that hold through the promulgation of their own intelligence services in Lebanon. Unlike Syria, which had this kind of dictatorial system for over 2 decades at this point, this sort of state under a state, Lebanon had never had this kind of system. And so numerous Lebanese were deported to Syria to languish in Syrian prisons. The presidential palace of Ba'abda was besieged by the Syrians in the latter days of the war, when Michel Aoun was the secondary president there. And Syria and Lebanon under occupation became very similar domestically to Syria, a slowly growing economy under an intense surveillance state and under military occupation. And while Israel occupied a small portion in the south of Lebanon, Syria's occupation was the entire eastern half of the country and significant presence in other parts of the country. It's worth taking a moment to talk a little bit about the Assad family drama. This is one of the few cases where you actually want to understand what life is like with the Kardashians, because it actually has implications for rulership. Now, in the initial days of Hafez al-Assad's rulership, he entrusted a significant amount of power to Rifat al-Assad, his brother. And Rifat was able to build a number of military installations. And in fact, he had his own private military contractor. He had a number of real estate investments. He was probably the wealthiest Syrian in the world. Now, when Hafez al-Assad had a heart attack on the 13th of November, 1983, Rifat al-Assad and a number of the other generals tried to rule in his name. And in fact, you have what is humorously called the poster war, where generals who were loyal to Rifat al-Assad, a smaller clique within the military, would put up a poster of Rifat over the pictures of Hafez al-Assad. Because as you can imagine, there were pictures of Hafez al-Assad everywhere. And so because Rifat was ruling, he wanted to put up his own pictures. And then the security apparatus that was connected to Hafez al-Assad would put a poster of Hafez on top of Rifat. So you had these posters on top of posters on top of posters on top of posters. When Hafez al-Assad recovered from his hospitalization in February of 1984, he promoted Rifat al-Assad to the vice presidency. He was one of 3 different vice presidents, and gave him a top secret mission on the 11th of March, 1984, to go to Paris and never come back. So naturally, Rifat al-Assad was removed from power. It was expected by most, including Hafez, that his eldest son, Basil, who you can see in the middle of that picture, would succeed him as the ruler of Syria. But unfortunately, Basil was killed in an automobile accident, and so he never had the opportunity. You can see a picture of his funeral right there. And that meant that Bashar was tapped when his father died to succeed Hafez. Now, Hafez al-Assad presided over the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, which meant that his relationship with the Soviet Union was no longer going to be viable. And so he decided to try and think of new ways to connect and to organize a state in order to continue surviving in the long term. The first one of these is that he predicted that the Soviet Union would begin to privatize a lot of the industries that were state-owned and use that money to prop up oligarchs. And in fact, that's what he did as well in order to keep the wealth in the Damascene clique that keeps him in power, along with his Alawite military system. He also had numerous conflicts with the Ba'ath in Iraq. In particular, the Ba'ath in Iraq had sponsored the Islamist uprising against him in 1982. They had sponsored a number of militias in Lebanon that were opposed to Syrian interests there. And so a natural move for that relationship was that when the Americans were looking for allies in their coalition against Saddam Hussein because of the Persian Gulf War, the Syrians were willing to join as part of that coalition. Assad promised up to 100,000 Syrian soldiers. Nothing close to that ever arrived. In fact, the Syrians have 2 casualties from the Persian Gulf War, which should show you how few of them there were. But the Syrian participation in the Persian Gulf War allowed Syria to redevelop relations with the United States and brought Syria in many ways out of the cold it had been with a lot of Western countries, especially as it continued its war against Israel, right? This sort of Cold War, right? Now that the Purple Line prevents Hafez al-Assad from attacking Israel directly. But al-Assad continued to stand against Zionism and imperialism, but because of his assistance with regards to Iraq, he was once again accepted, let's say, in polite company. One of the relationships that we haven't really talked about with Hafez al-Assad is his relationship with Turkey. We focused a lot on his relations to the south. But Hafez al-Assad had a very poor relationship with Turkey, and the primary reason for this was that he rejected the cession of Alexandretta. We've talked about how in 1938, the Turkish Republic demanded that the French give up the region of Alexandretta, the region the Turks call Hatay, to Turkey, and the French conceded. The Turkish invaded and claimed it for their own. Hafez al-Assad, as I said, did not recognize this. And so he had a very negative relationship with Turkey. As part of that relationship, he actually supported a number of groups designed to wage war internally with Turkey, especially the PKK, the People's Worker Party of Kurdistan. Now, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Now, in fact, Abdullah Öcalan, who was the leader of that movement, lived in Syria for most of the time that he was in operation. He was captured in 1999 when he had been forcibly evicted in 1998. Because of this, the PKK had established a number of bases in Syria, and throughout the 1970s, when Turkey was at war with the PKK, they would routinely evangelize and use Syria as a point of stability, as opposed to Turkey, where they were hunted down and destroyed. There were also, and so the resolution for this particular issue was the Adana Agreement. Turkey threatened invasion of Syria, and so Syria came to the drawing board. The Adana Agreement gave Turkey the right to invade Syria or to take care of any terrorist threat if the Syrians felt that they couldn't do it on their own. And so that's why they expelled Öcalan and many of the PKK supporters at that time. Another source of animosity between the Turks and the Syrians that hasn't changed to this day is that the Turks are planning to put numerous dams on the initial streams that flow into the Euphrates River. They also have ones on the Tigris River, which inflame Iraq to no end. But these dams would be excellent power generation for Turkey, but of course would lead to drought and other issues further downstream in Syria. To date, there's been no functional resolution to that, especially since Syria does not recognize the government of Bashar al-Assad since 2012. And now we get to the changing of the guard. So when Hafez al-Assad died, it wasn't entirely clear that Bashar al-Assad would succeed him from looking from the outsider's perspective point. But because of the family nexus of relationships that Hafez al-Assad had created, a path was set for Bashar al-Assad to assume power. In fact, he took the presidency within a few days of his father's funeral. You can see him there actually preparing to give his first speech as president. And similar to Hafez al-Assad, he came to the presidency through a referendum. And if you look at the referendum, you can actually see the green circle, you check it if you agree with his being president, and the gray circle is if you don't agree with him being president. There's no option for somebody else or a write-in candidate. In fact, Bashar al-Assad has won 4 such elections with sweeping percentages of the vote. There was some thought that perhaps Syria could modernize with Bashar al-Assad, being given the fact that he had lived in the UK. But it seems like when it came to the Cedar Revolution, that he really missed the opportunity to do this. And the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon was basically the Lebanese saying the Israelis have left as of the year 2000. They're no longer occupying the southern part of Lebanon. Syria, your point of being here is to protect us from the Israelis. The Israelis are gone. You can leave too. And the Cedar Revolution, we'll talk about a lot more in 2 weeks, was effective in pushing the Syrians out. Hafez al-Assad actually agreed to withdraw soldiers within basically 2.5 months after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri. It's believed that Hezbollah contributed to the death and Syrian agents were perhaps behind it, which is another reason why there was so much animus towards Syria from many in Lebanon. That said, Hezbollah has remained in Lebanon and continued to be part of Lebanese politics, often bringing about a pro-Syrian or a pro-Iranian perspective. And again, we'll talk more about how that affects Lebanon in the aftermath of the Cedar Revolution. But what's important to understand from a Syrian perspective is that this was very humiliating. Lebanon had basically told Syria that its entire idea of a greater Syria, of what people have been working centuries in terms of ideologically, people like Anton Saadeh, was not where they saw their value coming from, and that they saw the Syrian government as corrupt, and they saw the Syrian government as restricting their democratic liberties. And so they wanted the Syrians out. The early 2000s are primarily made up of changes within the American milieu around September the 11th. And this increasing preoccupation with terrorism and with weapons of mass destruction. And so while Syria was not named as one of the entities in Bush's axis, American President George Bush 43's axis of evil that he described on January 29th, Syria was subsequently added to that list and was considered a state sponsor of terror. John Bolton argued extensively about this within the United States government. And one of the major arguments that he had with the Syrians, of course, concerned the American invasion of Iraq. The Syrians were adamantly opposed to the US invasion. They thought it would be incredibly destabilizing, despite the fact, of course, that the Syrians had been part of the coalition in 1991. In that case, they had seen the Americans as being righteous in upholding the independence of the Kuwaitis. But in the case of overthrowing the government of Iraq, they didn't see it was the American place, and they thought it would invite more instability. In that regard, they weren't terribly wrong. But the American issue with Syria was not so much its rejection of the American invasion. That was almost predetermined. But the Americans accused the border between Syria and Iraq of being porous, and that Syria knowingly allowed militants to enter its territory that would then enter Iraqi territory and cause the deaths of American soldiers. The Syrians denied that they had any control over who was entering or leaving Iraq. Another argument made by the Americans and also by the Israelis was that Syria was beginning to collect and create weapons of mass destruction, especially in collusion with North Korea. In 2007, Israel bombed a site that they claimed was a nuclear site in Deir ez-Zor, which is in the middle of the eastern desert in Syria. IAEA inspectors later went to the site and discovered traces of unidentifiable nuclear remains, which gives a certain degree of credence to the Israeli claim. We then get to Arab Spring. And so Arab Spring really starts with a number of uprisings against economic inability to succeed in Tunisia and quickly expands outward. In Egypt, it leads to the downfall of the entire governmental apparatus. It leads to the downfall of Hosni Mubarak and the replacement of a significant part of the governmental apparatus. But that occurs mostly peacefully, with Omar Suleiman effectively conceding to the demands of the population within 2 weeks of the revolution starting, 25th of January to 11th of February. Syria is a very different story, and we can spend an entire series going through all of the different complexities of the Syrian civil war. There are a lot of things I want to highlight, but if I don't highlight your favorite thing, please ask about it in the comments and we can definitely talk about that. So the first protests started in small rural areas like Dara. And these areas had been disproportionately affected by Assad's policies and were economically in need of growth and development. But these protests began spreading to Damascus and other cities, demanding that Bashar step down. Bashar refused and began opening fire on the protesters, but the protesters endured. After several weeks of that, the protesters began to disperse and armed groups came to replace them. And the armed groups generally sit within two major categories. Three major categories. The first major category are Islamists, which of course, since they're militant, are properly termed jihadists. Jihadists are Islamists who believe that a theocratic government should be instituted through military means. Another category are those supported by foreign entities, like the Free Syrian Army, that is today supported by Turkey, or Hezbollah, which is supported by Iran. And then you have ethnically aligned militias, like the YPG, which is Kurdish aligned. So those three general categories began moving about Syria and taking control of different regions. What's important to point out, though, are several different things. The first one is that we saw the use of chemical weapons by the Assad government. Now, the Assad government contests this and argues that those were stolen by the rebels and used against the population, especially in Ghouta. there is no evidence from the perspective of Human Rights Watch and a number of other international organizations that this is the case. First of all, the regions that were attacked with chemicals were regions held by opposition figures. Secondly, the opposition doesn't have direct access to the chemical weapons while the regime does. And from a strategic point of view, those people who were sent to inspect the situation, if they came to any if they came to or were starting to come to any conclusion not amenable to the Syrian government under Assad, then they were removed from the investigation, which sort of shows the lack of transparency there. You also have a lot of times where you'll have mixed control. You can see, for example, in the anti-Assad protest from Aleppo, in the center of the screen, where they're using the flag of the pre-Ba'ath Syrian Republic, you have a mix of secular-leaning individuals and jihadists. Oftentimes, you'll have strange coalitions between these groups, and you'll even have fighting between groups that are of the same alignment, in theory. One particular example is that the movement Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the Syrian version of al-Qaeda, a jihadist organization, and Islamic State, Dawla Islamiyya Iraq wa Sham, right, Daesh, or ISIL or ISIS. Islamic State is also an al-Qaeda affiliate. In fact, it's the outgrowth of al-Qaeda Iraq, and I'm going to explain that in a few minutes. Jabhat al-Nusra was one of the strongest opponents of Islamic State. Not the strongest. The strongest was, of course, the YPG. But it was one of the strongest opponents of Islamic State because it rejected some of its territorial aspirations, which it thought were incommensurate with the ambit of al-Qaeda. So you have all these different groups that are fighting over territory. In the early days of the war, the opposition seemed to be doing more effectively. The success of the government is primarily due to chosen interference by Russia and Iran on behalf of the Syrian government. And in fact, by even as early as 2008, so before the Syrian war had broken out, Syria had more or less given up its security concerns to Iran and Russia. And so that ended up playing out longer in the war. The major areas held by the rebel forces around Idlib and around Azaz are those areas that are held by Turkish-backed FSA, Free Syrian Army, such as you can see when the Turkish supported groups attacked the Kurdish-held city of Afrin on the northern border of Syria and turned it into a Turkish-occupied zone, expelling significant portions of the local Kurdish population and repopulating it with Sunni refugees from other regions of the country. One particular group that I wanted to draw a little bit of attention to was the YPG. The YPG is a related offshoot of the PKK and believes in a communist style of government. So despite it being ethnically aligned with the Kurds, it does include numerous members of other groups. And in fact, the government that they formed, the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, is composed of individuals who are Arab, as well as people who are Assyrian, both in minorities. And these groups have created a quasi-independent state, at least until 2019. And that quasi-independent state, while it did have a certain degree of discrimination and nothing close to the level of discrimination that most Syrians underwent. This government, though, could not, this government, however, relied intensively on the American presence in Syria. And that American presence was dialed down by President Trump, quite famously in early 2018. And that was when the Turks decided to launch their invasion of a significant portion of territories held by SDF. In order to preserve what was left of their territory, the SDF aligned with Assad. And the Turks have characterized this kind of partnership as a replay of what had happened during the 1990s when Syria had been host to the PKK and Abdullah Öcalan. One of the things that we forget about talking about when we talk about the actual conflict itself and the various movement of forces is the size and scope of the refugee problem. Syria pre-war had a population of about 20 million people. Of that population, over half are either IDPs, that's internally displaced persons, that's a person who lives in their same country, but does not live in the same place that they're accustomed to in their own country. So they're a refugee, but they just haven't crossed the border, for want of a better term. A refugee is somebody who has crossed the border and is in a different country. And so there are, as you can see, significantly more IDPs than there are refugees. And of the 4 million refugees by September 2015, that number has risen significantly since then. I couldn't find an accurate number for the moment. Those refugees disproportionately stayed in the border countries. That's Jordan, that's Lebanon, that's Turkey. In fact, Turkey has taken on more refugees than any other country. And Lebanon has taken on more refugees per capita than any country on earth from Syria. In fact, as you can see from that map there, some regions of Lebanon, especially those abutting Syria, have taken they've taken thousands of people per town in the district. And the refugee camps that have been assembled to bring in the Syrian refugees in the Arab world and in Turkey are immense. Probably the most famous and one of the largest of the Syrian refugee camps is Zaatari refugee camp, which is home to 80,000 people. That is actually a view of the camp from the air. You can't even see the whole camp. It's arranged in a number of hovels along major roads. And the Syrians have been so incredibly resourceful there that a pizza delivery service developed, and the pizza delivery service actually identified the names of the streets, which had never been named before, in order to accelerate its pizza delivery service. And then camp operators got wind of this and started applying that system on their own, because they thought it was so useful to actually start identifying the hovels as being somewhere. Most Syrian refugees, especially those that are located still within the Middle East, want to return to Syria. They're just waiting for a time when that can happen. Those who've gone to the European Union, their flight is probably a little bit longer term. And of course, there's a long discussion, and we had that discussion to a certain degree in my European Union series on how the Syrian migration affected the European Union and what European leaders have decided to do about it. Suffice it to say, integration for Syrians is very difficult in Europe because many Syrians are either uneducated or undereducated. If they are educated, they might have beliefs that are contrary to the political systems in which they now sit, or culture clash with those new areas as well. One of the particular tragedies of a lot of the Syrian refugees is that some of them are what are called double refugees, in that they were originally refugees from Iraq, because between 2003 and 2011, Iraq was significantly less stable than Syria. That was during the American occupation period. And so those people went to Syria. And then those people, now that they were in Syria, and Syria became worse than Iraq was after 2011 when the Americans left, they came back to Iraq. But under refugee law, a person who returns to his country of origin negates his refugee status. So a lot of these people unknowingly dashed any hope for a long-term refugee claim by going back between these two very unstable countries. There's a point here also that while Israel didn't take refugees, Israel did accept wounded Syrians across the UNDOF and applied medicine to them. Israel's policy was to take any person regardless of affiliation. They wouldn't ask affiliation in order to stay completely neutral in the Syrian civil war. And that has meant that Israel has helped, for want of a better term, innocent civilians, and for want of a better term, jihadists. All these people have received medical aid and have been returned back to the UNDOF to be taken to the Syrian side of the border. Of course, another part that should be mentioned is the story of the Palestinians in the Syrian civil war. And we've talked a bit about that in our episodes on the Palestinians. Of course, Palestinians were not the only ones subjected to torture from Assad, and they weren't the only ones traveling in rafts to get to Europe. That was a fate shared with Syrian Palestinian, with Syrians who were not Palestinians. But the direct targeting of refugee camps when Syrian Palestinians could not leave those camps, and the splitting of Syrian Palestinians from other Syrian refugees, like, for example, that Za'atar refugee camp is forbidden for Syrian Palestinians. They have to go to Cyber City refugee camp, also in Jordan. And so you have this distinction. And why is it that you have this distinction? Well, Khalid Mashal, who was the head of Hamas and based in Damascus, very early in the revolution, took an anti-Assad stance. And it's understandable why he did that, considering that Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, the same Muslim Brotherhood that the Assads pummeled into the ground in the 1980s. So any anti-Assad stance would generally be in their wheelhouse. But unfortunately, that meant that the Syrian regime would no longer prioritize or protect the lives of the Palestinians under its care. And many opposition groups saw these Palestinian refugee camps as fertile grounds for possible recruitment, since many of these people had no viable life outside. There's a question of whether the intentional double displacement aided Islamic State forces. The porosity of the border is something that we're going to talk about, but generally speaking, no. The movement of the people didn't help. Except to the extent that you could smuggle people into one conflict or the other. But from a military standpoint, it's just the porosity of the border. And actually, we're about to talk about Islamic State. So Islamic State really got its start from Al-Qaeda Iraq, as I mentioned, in 2013. And Al-Qaeda Iraq's leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, had an epiphany. Sorry, 2013. If I said 1913, 2013. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi had a thought, which was Al-Qaeda is an internationalist jihadist group, meaning that they believe that they should start jihadism all around the world. And when the world is ready for a universal revolution that will create sort of an Islamic sympathy, then you can create a state. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi said, why not start now? And so while he was having difficulty dealing with the Iraqi security forces, he realized that a significant portion of the cross-border region in Syria was up for the taking because of the locations of Assad's forces, the rebel forces, and so on. And so he crossed the border with his Al-Qaeda Iraq forces and conquered a territory in Syria based on the city of Raqqa. Using that as a base, in June of 2014, he actually invaded the north of Iraq. And from the north of Iraq, especially in the city of Mosul, he was able to acquire a significant amount of American weaponry that had been left in the city for the Iraqis to use. So, and that was also along with cash that Americans had left behind, again, for the Iraqi security forces to use. The Iraqis simply didn't resist effectively because the army didn't feel a significant amount of loyalty to the government under Nouri al-Maliki. That said, you've now created this jihadist group based in the eastern part of Syria and the northern part of Iraq that was flush with cash and had a significant cache of weapons that could then begin to expand its process. There's a follow-up question here that in terms of empathies and our manipulation or simple human needs, with regards to crossing the border, most of the people that Islamic State recruited were people that were either outside of the territory, they recruited them in. We're going to talk a little bit about self-radicalization in just a second. Or they were people who were in possession of certain skills that they needed. For example, they needed people who spoke different foreign languages in order to be involved in recruitment, people who understood website design and social media in order to create a social media presence. They weren't typically targeting migrants. It wasn't good for business. Now, if those migrants were women and they were, for want of a better term, impregnatable, that was something else. And so you would have women that would be taken to be given as wives to jihadist fighters. But again, they weren't sort of hunting down migrants to find that. They were usually attacking non-Muslim populations, especially groups like Yazidi, Yarsani, Shiites, in order to find that. Christians. So, like the Assyrian population. So you then have this situation where this state was able to expand and to grow. And this state became what was effectively a jihad state. It's a state that is eternally at war with all of its neighbors and has no method of declaring peace, because every other state is not an Islamic theocracy like they are. Now, there are other rebel groups that may declare themselves as franchisees of Islamic State. They follow the ideology and are trying to declare independence in their own territories. Those are recognized by Islamic State as part of their larger enterprise. But any other state is one that they cannot have peace with. And so Islamic State began to evangelize its perspective. And this evangelization is what is often called self-radicalization, which I think is a horrible title, because it completely negates how much effort is actually put in by the jihadists. The particular issue with self-radicalization is that, like the YouTube algorithm, it finds people that are looking for some meaning, some purpose in their life, and then proceeds to give them that purpose. And a radicalizer puts you in touch with different materials, lets you educate yourself, but in this way that's slowly drawn to make you believe the ideas of jihadism. So it's not that you've radicalized yourself through an affirmative action. You've been led down this slow rabbit hole of increasingly more and more belligerent talking points, increasingly more and more violent and sadistic material, and increasingly more heterodox Islamic beliefs in order to justify the creation of this caliphate. A caliphate which, by the way, was recognized by no other country or no other group of Muslim people. So in many ways, the entrance to Islamic State is very similar to the entrance to a cult. And we don't say that people who've been recruited to a cult are self-radicalized, but yet because of the dimensionality of the internet and the methodology that's much more similar to a YouTube rabbit hole, it appears to people as self-radicalization rather than intentional targeting. That's weird. All right. So welcome to the Q&A period. This is History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. I'm Richard, and we meet Wednesdays at 7 p.m. There are two other, there's Asian philosophy that Jason Peng teaches. There's the European Union Security. We're a little bit on hiatus for the moment. Powerful Women and Dead Languages. And we have a Ukraine episode coming up in a week.
Hi, Richard. Can I add to it a little bit as well?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. So this we can. I don't know if you guys are interested to watch as well. Our friend Narul is going to do Modi question. He's going to talk about the radicalization of India. Obviously, I don't want to reveal a lot of the information, but please join us. It's on a meetup as well. And then we will, at the end of May, we'll have Templars. If you guys are interested, we're going to talk about the history of Templars Order. We've done several of those, beginning with the Teutonic Knights. We did others, but Templars is just in the row. Our friend Jonathan is going to actually bring up a lot of the weaponry. I mean, it's not authentic, but replicas, and he's going to talk about what was used during the particularly march to Jerusalem, and stuff like that. And the end, also at the beginning of June, we're going to have a presentation on powerful women, as Richard had stated. And please, watch our philosophy. And obviously a lot of the Richard presentations are amazing. In philosophy, we discuss the Indian and Chinese philosophy. Like right now, they're going through Art of War. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there as well. So that's it for me. Sorry.
No, that's fantastic. So considering that my normal question slide is clearly not working because of whatever happened with the images, if there are any questions, the two slides that I didn't get to, and I don't think that they're really that necessary, is one about Israeli airstrikes that Israel's coordinating with Russia and in order to attack Iranian positions inside of Assad, Syria. And so Israel almost has free reign in terms of its own air force over Syria, which is a very strange violation of national sovereignty. But that's because of Syria throwing in its lot with the Russians in order to, Assad throwing in his lot with the Russians in order to maintain stability. And the other slide was that because of the earthquake earlier this year in late February, I believe, a lot of humanitarian aid has gone to Syria, and a lot of Arab regimes, especially UAE, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, have made the choice to reopen relations with the Assad government that they had closed as a result of the war between the Syrian civil war and their previous support for the opposition. So there's a question of will this rehabilitate Syria in terms of international standing? And in many cases, the issues that Westerners would have, such as his human rights abuses, such as his difficulty in strategic positioning relative to, for example, Saudi Arabia. Syria is clearly on the opposite side of the Iranian Saudi proxy war. It doesn't seem good strategically. The only logical reason is that they don't want Syria to become an economic hellhole, because then that will breed terrorism and other issues.
Richard, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
On a personal level, regarding Bashar Assad. Now, this person, lives in London, has his own practice, does well as far as, graduating school, keeps to himself. All of a sudden, his brother passes away, or during the accident, he comes back. How does one turn into what he turned into? Being the fact that, that he gives an oath, not deliberately hurt anybody during his graduation from medical school. I mean, just on a general level, like a human to human. How does one turn into this evil person? Or was it?
I mean, there are entire psychology papers written on how does one become a Nazi. And I would second the comment here that that I hope that Bashar will be either judged in person or in absentia in a human rights court if they can't bring his body in there in person. But generally speaking, and this is something that a lot of people forget, because I'm going to talk about Nazi mental studies because I understand those a lot better than I can opine on somebody who I actually don't know personal characteristics about. Nazis generally divide into three categories. The first category is people who, and we're talking about Nazis who performed inhuman acts, right? Not just people who signed up one day and like went home or something. I don't know. There's the category of people that did it because they were told to do it and they obeyed the orders, and that was it. That's category one. And you have people like Ohlendorf who sort of fit in that category. You have those who are those who are, they slowly go in deeper and deeper into the pool, and at each stage they self-justify, and outside of their inhuman activities, they're remarkably human. Most Nazi prison guards, for example, if we read their personal letters to their family and friends, sound perfectly normal. And then the third category is those people like Heinrich Himmler who are just out to lunch, right? These are people who are just completely crazy by normal understanding. There are very few people in category 3, just generally speaking. If you look at most of the literature, very few people in category 3. Most of the people are in category 1 or 2. And Bashar al-Assad strikes me as one of those in category 1 or 2. He doesn't strike me as off the wall crazy. And in fact, a lot of the mechanisms of rule that he uses are very similar to those of Hafiz al-Assad. So because of that similarity, I would say that what ended up happening is that between 2000 and 2005, again, this is my intuition, I'm not basing this off of any particular materials, but he was considering doing some kind of reform activity. But after the Cedar Revolution and he was ejected from Lebanon, he felt the need to control what he had much more effectively. And when the revolution happened, I think he felt that there was no way that he would be able to stay in power if he didn't remove the opposition entirely. And so he tried to do what his father had done with Hama and blow it into the ground. One of the things that his father did, though, while he was blowing up Hama, was reaching out to the Alpine economic groups and giving them carte blanche to design their own economic policy, which meant that they had a vested interest in the Muslim Brotherhood not winning. And Bashar didn't do that. So I think that Hafiz al-Assad is just a better Machiavellian than Bashar is. I don't think that Bashar is an idiot. I think he's just not as good. Patty, you have your hand up?
Yeah, two things. The second one will be on the poll. I think those questions I was asking about that massive displacement issue, the sensibility that I have that would be a natural aid to an organization or trying to be organization like ISIL because of the massive disorientation. I mean, so that would seem to aid that rabbit hole thing that you mentioned in terms of recruitment, but also being able to manipulate that massively displaced population to assist in whatever ISIL fighters might need in any given moment. That's what I was trying to get at.
Say the latter is certainly more a case than the former.
Okay.
The issue with self-radicalization is that it relies very heavily on consistent relationship between the recruiter and the recruitee, right? Perfect example, imagine that you have a Skype friend or a WhatsApp friend or a texting friend, whatever. And like every day he sends you an article of like something to read. Like,
there's a reason why I don't have that kind of friend, by the way.
right. But this is the thing, right? The Islamic State is not trying to recruit 70-year-olds or 60-year-olds or whatever. They're trying to recruit 15-year-olds and 20-year-olds because those are the people you can send to the front lines to fight. And so they're very technologically savvy because that's exactly who they're going for. But this system works so long as you can't have physical contact with that person. The moment that you're actually dealing with a recruiter face to face, the intimacy of that kind of relationship actually makes the person less inclined to follow through on the idea, because then they feel that they're not making the investment's being made at them. And you can see this because if you have in-person cults, like the Moonies, for example, they have a very different style of recruiting than self-radicalization, right? They're not using this sort of YouTube algorithm, newspaper article by day approach. They're using like, come to this 6-hour seminar while we bore you to death, so that you're sort of hypnotized a little bit. So very different approach.
You'd be surprised how many 60 and 70-year-olds do get involved with things that way. I know a lot of
there are. No, I would say the QAnon phenomenon is very well targeted at 60 and 70-year-olds. But Islamic State, you have to remember, I'm trying to find the right way to say this. I don't think QAnon was invented with the purpose of going after stay-at-home
people. Yeah.
I think that ended up being their target. That ended up being their target base, and they saw that it was very successful, but I don't think that was their intention. Islamic State was specifically targeting young men and young women, because remember, those soldiers have to have wives, right? Women can't fight, but those soldiers have to have wives. So they target men and women between the ages of 15 and 20. So they developed a system for that.
That is just soul chilling to me. Yeah, I understand that. But I just wanted to clarify, because I wasn't quite understanding what the relative influences were.
Sure. Generally speaking, when Islamic State would move into a town, they would, it's actually very similar to the Mongols. They would try to find anybody who had useful skills that they could apply to their effort. So if you had somebody who was a computer programmer, we need that guy to start building our servers in this city. We need the people who can design the web page, the people who can update the Twitter accounts, the people who can film the videos of our sadistic torture, so that way we can show people that we're genuine about what we say we're going to do. We need this person, to coordinate the town square. We need, these are the people who are useful. We'll put them to work in those useful capacities. These are the people who are less useful. We'll make them plant.
Yeah. So if you're displaced, you're going to sell what you can do,
right?
Just because you need to survive, right? That's the part I was.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
But a lot of people will still flee, right? And a lot of the people, if you fled from one tyrannical government, you're probably going to keep fleeing from every tyrannical government that follows you. It's very rare that the problem with the double refugees is that the law hasn't caught up with the reality.
Wow.
So the law is, under the 1951 Refugee Convention, I don't have the entire text in front of me, but basically the principle is you have to demonstrate that you left your home country based on a reasonable fear of what could happen to you if you left. And if you go back to that country, it demonstrates, at least in theory, that you're not afraid of whatever's in that country because you went back there. And it doesn't take into account the fact that your choices between instability A and instability B might be the case that instability A was originally worse than instability B, then instability B became worse than instability A, and so you decide, you know what, I'll take my chances with instability A. Doesn't mean instability A is any better than it was before. It just means that instability B has changed. So you have this,
the impossibility of the stew even more huge than I tend to understand. I mean, I can understand it as a stew, but once you start explaining all those intricacies, it's like, oh my God, how do we ever unwind this?
Yeah. And one of the things that, I really didn't talk about with regards to Islamic State, of course, is the abducted women.
Yeah.
Both from Yazidi and from Assyrian Christian backgrounds, as well as other women from other backgrounds who not only were subject to sexual violence and other words that I probably can't say on YouTube from Islamic State fighters, but because of that defilement are not accepted within their own people now that liberation has come. So they're ostracized by the people who should be caring for them, and they're ashamed of what happened to them, even though, of course, they were victims.
So on the poll, I just wondered if you had any comment. I was noticing that it was evenly divided between whether people thought Bashar or
Hafez.
was the more brutal. I thought Hafez, but do you have an opinion on that?
I feel like Hafez Assad was more brutal, but I think Bashar had a longer time to express it. The Syrian civil war has probably killed around 700,000 people already, and that's on the low side. We've never seen anything that big from Hafez al-Assad because he didn't let it get that big, right? When he attacked Hama and he killed at least 10,000 people in the city because he bombed his own city from the air. I think that sent a very chilling lesson, and the fact that he had the mukhabarat, his internal intelligence, operating throughout the country, abducting who knows how many people. You have all these different issues. So
I mean, it depends too on how. I mean, morally, we agreed from the beginning that Bashar, Hafez was Machiavellian, but I think brutality-wise, Bashar has been, he's cold-bloodedly, so like you say, bombing his own city, right? I'm going to take care of this before it gets even bigger. Boom.
Yep.
To me, that's a kind of one is a more morally offensive. I'm not justifying it. The other one, though, is more directly brutal to me.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I have a comment here. I can see Turkey better in relation to Ukraine too from this talk. Yeah, absolutely. Turkey is, I've been debating whether I want to do a modern Turkey episode or two modern Turkey episodes, because I've left Turkey off in 1938. But Turkey is sort of in this very interesting position where it joined NATO in 1950 because of direct threats from Stalin. Stalin wanted to annex territory that was held by the Republic of Turkey. Turkey didn't want that, and so it entered this alliance with the United States. But Turkey also sees itself as a regional power player, and they threatened to invade Syria, as we saw here, because of the threat of the PKK, at least from their understanding. And they see themselves as a dominant power in the region, and that's only going to get stronger as Syria, Iraq, Iran, the Balkans countries all continue to get weaker. And Syria and Russia have this antagonistic relationship because of the historic Russo-Turkish situation for hundreds of years. We've covered that in some of the earlier lectures, especially episode 27. But at the same time, Turkey sees Russia as a possible angle at getting back at the United States, and it needs to deal with Russia in the context of Syria, because the Turkish support the FSA. The FSA is a direct enemy of the Assad government. So Turkey and Russia have to see eye to eye to a certain extent there, and Turkey wants to use Russia as a counterbalance lever from the Americans to get what they want.
I'd be very interested in a modern Turkey, assuming we all live that long, because you covered so much ground. But yeah, I think there's a lot that is very relevant to today's situation that has changed within the last 20 or 30 years in Turkey.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting and volatile situation. One other thing that I have a comment here that Machiavelli said it was better to be feared than loved, and it seems to be all you need to know about the Assads. I spent 2 hours saying otherwise, so I can't say that's the only thing worth knowing, but I think that Assad definitely, that Hafez Assad especially, ran his country in specifically a way where he positioned all the elements that were opposed to him against each other, and took them out one by one as they were not dealing with him.
The manipulation was what I've meant by Machiavellian with him.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the point. The one last thing that I want to address before I close it out, if nobody else has any questions, is Alawism. And I mentioned that I would talk about that a little bit. A lot of people say that because people sort of debate what is a Muslim and what is not a Muslim. And with regards to Alawites, it's both politically sensitive because of, as we mentioned, that the leader of Syria has to be a Muslim, and there's all this, for want of a better term, argument that Alawites are not Muslims and therefore they can't be in official rulership position. And also a lot of Alawites think that they're Muslims, but I think that sort of operates independently from whether they are in sort of some objective sense Muslims. And there's also a different definition of what is a Muslim and what isn't. Where being a Muslim is respecting the 5 pillars and or maybe just saying the Shahada or something like that. And in those regards, Alawites are Muslims, but there are sort of 3 major ways in which Alawites manifest a differing set of beliefs. The first one is that they believe in a number of doctrines from Neoplatonism and from Gnostic Christianity. So they celebrate, for example, the Feast of the Epiphany, Palm Sunday, Christmas and Easter. They drink wine and consecrate wine as part of holy activities. Wine is forbidden by the Quran. They also have a number of beliefs about what's called the demiurge, meaning that the creator of the universe is actually a subordinate entity to an actual greater entity, which is the good entity. And that greater entity has come to earth in 3 different forms, in Muhammad, and Ali, and Salman the Persian. And through that trinity of Muhammad, Ali, and Salman the Persian is the true way to know the real God, the lovable God, not the God who created this broken world. You also have the idea of reincarnation and emanations. Alawites believe that humans come around and again in reincarnated forms. Islam doesn't argue that.
Islam, though, is decidedly non-Trinitarian, didn't you say?
Yes.
Okay.
Islam believes quite exclusively in a single God. So no, a lot of the beliefs of Alawites, although Ibn Nusayr, who was the founder of the doctrine, was himself a Shiite Muslim, and Alawites all come from Islam. I would argue that Alawism is a post-Islamic religion, in the same way that Mormonism is a post-Christian religion. It asserts things that are antithetical to Christian doctrine, but all of its practitioners were former Christians. And they take their ideas from Christianity. And probably the biggest idea that especially contrasts with Sunni Islam is the idea of Batiniya. And we've sort of covered this in other presentations, but Batiniya is this idea that the real world that we see is an artificial simulacra of the world. And the true world, the true meaning of the world, can only be accessed by those who have the pure knowledge. Probably the clearest representation of this is that scene in The Matrix, where Neo sees that the walls and the floor and the agents that are pursuing him are actually just lines of code. And that's the reality. He's in a computer system. He can control that computer system because he sees the actual reality, not the walls and the agents and the tables and the floors and everything that are represented through the programming of the Matrix to fool his eyes, to fool his ears, to fool every sensory organ in his body. That's the Batiniya. Being able to see the underlying computer code of reality. And Islam, as a general matter, especially Sunni Islam, argues that Batiniya exists, but that Batiniya is represented through the Zahiriya, what we can see and what we can interact with. And so there's not much difference between the Batiniya and the Zahiriya, other than the Batiniya gives meaning and direction to the Zahiriya.
That's interesting. There's at least one Asian outgrowth that I know of that sort of operates on that principle. It's actually called, you're trying to go to knowledge, which is that realm beyond.
Right. No, this Gnosticism was very popular in Asia as well. Manichaeism, which is a faith that existed in Western China until the mid 1600s.
Interesting.
So these ideas made their way to Asia. They were immensely popular before Gnostic Christianity was defeated by Pauline Christianity. We talked about that actually a little bit in our episode on early Christian heresies. And so a lot of these sort of doctrines come out of that. And so that's why there's sort of a difference between Alawites and Muslims. And that's why for those, most Syrians are not familiar with Alawite doctrine to the degree that I've discussed it here. Never mind that what I've talked about here is a very, it's a 5-minute distillation of what are books and books and books on Alawite beliefs and structure and the rest of it. But most Syrians have an intuition that there's something not Muslim about them, and that's why there was so much antipathy to them ruling a country where it says the president of the republic's religion is Islam.
Yikes. It gets so complicated once you bring religion into it, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, I'm in favor of secular republics, but that's just me.
Yeah, it's so hard for some people, though. It seems very hard for people to keep the two tracks separate, both and as opposed to either or. But
yeah, no, I agree.
This has been fascinating, Richard. Thank you. This night in particular, I don't know why, it's just brought a lot together that I maybe had not quite connected fully before.
I think it's one of those things. We've seen Syria so much in the news over the last 10 years because of the war. And you have somebody who's there and they give like a 5 minutes bit of like, today in the city of we can see the militants moving on the right hand side, and but why and who are they, and does it even matter? And so this tried to.
My favorite was the interview I saw with what's his name? Was it Gary Johnson or something like that? That was running.
Where's Aleppo?
Yeah, what's Aleppo? He didn't even connect Aleppo. He couldn't understand the question, and that's one of my all-time favorites because he was actually running for president at the time.
Well, I think if they'd asked Trump that question, he would have had a head scratcher too. But
yeah, but he was presenting himself as the non-Trumpian alternative, if you recall.
Yeah, no, I do. All right. Anyway, I'm going to close this out. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we will see each other next week to discuss Lebanon in the wake of World War II.
Well, have a great week.
All right, you too.
Blessings. Bye, all.
All right, bye.